Welcome to the Home Building Hub, your essential podcast guide to building your new home. Hosted by industry experts Colin Bischoff and Darren Brennan, this conversational podcast will help better educate you about all things new home building so you can avoid costly mistakes and enjoy your building experience to the fullest, no matter which home builder you choose.
Hey there folks, Colin here from the Home Building Hub. Welcome to another episode. I'm here with co-host Darren Brennan as always, and today we're going to share with you and talk about the topic of structural changes. So we're going to go through and share some of our insights and our experience into, I guess, some of the good things you can do with structural changes, but also highlight to you some of the implications of structural changes that have gone wrong. So we're just going to give you a better understanding of what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And of course, it's dependent on sales consultants, dependent on the builder. So we'll go through all of that for you today. So good morning, Darren. How are you today?
Hey, Cole. Going great, mate. Great subject, I reckon, to talk about something that we've had a fair bit of experience in and got it right so many times and really stuffed it up a number of others. So probably pretty relevant, mate. So yeah, let's rip into it. I'll obviously we have a fee for the podcast, so we'd love people to share the podcast with others. That'd be really appreciated. Grab the link, flick it over to a mate, and hopefully they get some value out of the podcast as well. The other part is, if you do like the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. The more of those we can get, the more likely we get a bit more exposure. And it's great for, the building industry, which is doing a little tough right now. So, we'd really appreciate that. The other part, our disclaimer, I'll rip into that. So whilst we are all about providing value to you, this podcast should not be considered as legal or financial advice. It contains general information only, and you should seek out independent professional advice on your personal situation before making any legal or financial decisions. So, mate, nailed all that. I reckon we've done well, kicked off quickly.
Yeah.
I'm going to rip straight to you, Cole. Many people like to make changes to the plan. So is it the right move, mate?
Well, I guess it's, good question. So the first thing we want to establish with our listeners, just for the people who are newer to this process, when we're referring to structural changes, we're talking about what we would call changes to the design, changes to the dwelling that you would maybe call major structural changes. We're not talking about minor changes. So we'll help understand the difference there. So let's say you've got a design that has an open lounge or an open theatre or media room. A structural change whereby you add some plaster and some cavity or 2 cavity sliding doors to close that room off. That's not what we would consider a structural change that's really going to impact much. It's a pretty simple, straightforward cosmetic change. So we're not referring to that today. We're just going to share our insights and the good bits and the bad bits about more so structural changes that impact that design entirely. So if the bedroom's at the front on the standard plan and you want to put it at the back, that's a major structural change. If you want to increase the width or the depth of the house, etc., I should say. So that's what we're going to cover. And I think, Darren, to help listeners initially, let's probably give a little bit of a scope of what do builders actually allow and what do they not allow, because it is obviously dependent on the builder before we get into some of the the good things and the bad things about structural changes. So if you could help, maybe if you go first with your experience and the builders you've been with, and then I might just finish off with my experience too. So what do builders actually allow when it comes to structural changes?
Yeah, and I guess the short answer to that is some will allow nothing at all, and others will allow you to pretty much fully customize the home, and so it's pretty hard to know what you're going to be allowed. You walk in, let's say you go to a display home, you walk in the front door of one and they're like, here's a red pen. And the very first builder I worked for, that was part of their catch cries. They handed out red pens. And then you go to another builder and they're like, no, sorry, you can't make any changes. But you're talking about earlier, Cole, some of those things that are not really considered, we don't consider structural changes like putting a wall in and putting some doors on for some of those builders, it'll be, no, you can't do that. Like,
Mm.
our design's our design. That's how it rolls. You can't change it. So I guess I want to give you some examples of the builders that I've worked for. So the first builder I worked for, they basically allowed you to do whatever you wanted. They fully custom. And what's interesting is that was the first builder I'd worked for. So my experience in fully customizing a house wasn't huge. So I wasn't particularly great at it to start off with. And yet I've got a red pen and a ruler. I was pretty good at school with a red pen and a ruler. So I was all right. I could draw pretty well, but now, like, I'm an architect at that point. Like, no, I'm not. So it's pretty scary. So that was builder number one. And literally, it was on me to draw it up. We could nearly do it on the back of a serviette, and they'd work out a way to draw it. Like, it was incredible. And there was lots of things that could go wrong in that process. The next builder I worked for allowed some changes, and some of those changes could be significant at times. And what I mean by at times was there were times when they allowed more changes because the business wasn't quite as busy, and less changes when they were really busy. They also had some ranges that didn't allow changes at all. And also different areas of Melbourne or regional Vic, because they operated through all those areas, different areas would allow different changes. So that was sort of interesting. And again, they used to charge a fee to redesign in some areas, others not. So it was a bit confusing for the staff, but also confusing for the customer, because they get one answer at one display and a different answer at another. So, that's that one. The next builder I worked for, they allowed changes to about 50% of their design. Now, they had a pretty strict policy that said you were allowed to do this, and if you did this, that made it this type of job, type A, and then if you made further changes, that was a type B job, and if you made even more changes, that was a type C job, and then each one of those required different deposit amounts, and each one of those was handled differently. And so if you were on a type B, which had, reasonable changes, or a type C that had heaps of changes, well, then they would go and do a sketch of that for you, but you were paying for that. Like, it came at a cost. And then it came at time. So that time was normally 14 days. You'd get back the drawing, you'd review that, see if you liked it. If you didn't like it, you'd make more changes. When you made more changes, they charge you more money for those more changes. So they had a redesign fee, and that was a cost per square meter. So it was a bit of an arduous journey. And so you might not lock down your design. You meet with a sales consultant, sketch it up, pay some money, go through that process, 14 days, get it back, or 14 days to get it back in or out, either way. So there's a month, get the design back 14 days later. There's another, you could burn 2-3 months before you've even got to a point of saying I've agreed on the actual design. So it could be long and arduous as well, is my point. And look, in the end, their process was pretty good, and there was a lot of advice given along the way. So I think that part worked well, and that was part of their unique selling proposition, was that process. But it's just different again. And now, I work at Metricon, and in the region I work in, we allow some changes, definitely allow some changes, depending on the home, and depending on, because we have different ranges of homes. Generally, the bigger the range, the higher the specification of the home, the more changes we sort of allow. We understand that suits that buyer more. I guess when it gets really complex and we're dealing on bigger homes, we actually get the customer to come into our office and meet with one of our designers. So that's part of our process, is sit down with a designer, because we're not relying on the consultant to necessarily be the expert and make sure that can work. So one, it's working on the plan, and two, it's working in the real. So when we build it, so they'll seek advice of our construction team to make sure we get all that right. So there's just all these different processes, and that's over 4 builders. Well, there's so many builders out there, so everyone's process is different. I'd love to know with you, Colin, right now, you guys allow changes with H&L. What does that look like, and how do you guys handle that?
Yeah, good question. So it's different. So where I work now, we're sort of built to do custom changes as a business and as a strategy. That's what we do. We can take a blank page or a regular lot, which means like a one that's not a rectangle, that's got some strange dimensions, and we can create what we would call a concept plan and pop that on there. after getting a brief from the client. So they'll say, look, I want 4 beds, I want 2 living, I want about this size, because we generally work off custom rates. So we can essentially say, look, if it's 22 square custom home, it's going to cost you around this ballpark, and then we can work on the design. So I guess on one side of the coin, there are builders and there are businesses out there that can absolutely help you with getting a custom plan, or at least a standard plan that they've got, and making adjustments and changes to it. It can happen, and most of the time it can work quite well. But what I'd probably, and we'll go deeper into this through this episode, Darren, what I'd warn people about is just saying, who is making those structural changes? As you said, when you started, you had a red pen and a bit of whiteout and a ruler. I did too, and I had no idea really. But here I am making structural changes for people.
You
Like,
had a good
you've
teacher
got
back
to,
then.
yeah, that's right. I can't remember his name. Yeah, so it's about understanding that, okay, if you're going to a volume builder, most volume builders in a normal, everyday, affordable type range, you're better off sticking with the standard plan and not trying to change too much, because potentially, or asking the sales consultant, what's their level of experience, how long have they been doing this, and justifying, making sure that the changes that they're proposing are going to work. Now, the only reason we put that, I guess I say that, Darren, is because whilst we've got so many that have worked and ended up the way the client wants, there's also some that haven't. And that's the thing I would like to prevent people from doing. I believe that in the current market, it's probably been like that for a number of years. People sometimes just want to grab a standard plan and they want to make a structural change just to make it their own, just for the sake of making a structural change. And I've seen that backfire a lot. The standard plans created by builders have been done by professionals, and they fit and they work and they're really good. As we said at the top, cosmetic changes, little bolt-ons like, doors and extra plaster and, things like that, they're fine. But we would say be quite wary, I would say, when you're talking about making structural changes. The question you've got to ask yourself is, are you a draftsperson? Are you an architect? And are you qualified to put forward these suggestions yourself? And whether you are or you're not, it's your call. But my advice to you is just to be a little bit careful and take the advice of the builder if they're recommending, because it is a duty of care on their side to say, look,
Absolutely.
I don't think that's going to work, or it's not going to look good. You're going to have a 1.5 meter room there. It's not enough. What I see happen a lot, Darren, is people see visually the bird's eye view of the plan, and they go, yeah, I've got 4 beds, I've got 2 living, I've squeezed it all into a 20 square home. And they're like, yeah, it looks practical. But when you go and walk through that thing, you're going to be like, you can almost like touch both sides of the walls of the bedrooms, by putting your arms out, because it's 2.7 meters or 2.8 meter bedrooms. And I think that's probably the biggest mistake I've seen people make, is they've just over designed it to squeeze another room in, and it's really quite dangerous. The outcome is not that pretty at the end of the day quite often. So,
and in that space, Paul, it can be a challenge because, people are, and right now it's never been more the case, I reckon, is that people's budgets are pretty tight. So they're going, geez, I've got to try and squeeze a bit more into this house to get it to work because I can't afford to go a bigger house.
yeah.
That's certainly a juggle, right? So, it's we certainly appreciate the position people are in, is more where I'm coming from, that, sometimes you're trying to do these things with a really good reason in mind, which is, I just can't afford it. So how else do I get that extra bedroom? I've got, I need it because I've got 3 kids, I need 4-bedroom home. It's a challenge. It's certainly a challenge. So it doesn't get any easier in that respect, I guess, but, work with your sales consultant, as you say, and look towards getting a really good outcome there.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess with some of those, Colin, what are some of the stuff that, what are some of the things that have worked, or what are some of the tips you could give around that do work well?
Yeah. So there are some changes, and builders are set up a little bit better these days. One of the most common things you'll see is what we call design options. So you'll grab a standard plan that's X size, and the builder will actually have pre-drawn, pre-priced design options, like maybe the ensuite's different, bigger shower, double vanity. Maybe the kitchen design's different with the walk-in pantry layout. Maybe there's a theatre room instead of a bed for, or things like that. They have them pre-drawn for you just to simply tick. If you're going to make structural changes, they're actually the best ones to do, because they're pre-drawn, pre-priced. The builder's done it before, and that's going to have a better outcome because it's been proven, tested, and practically built. It's not just winging it, basically. So I'd say if you're going to make structural changes with a volume builder, that's definitely it. There are some minor ones like adding length to the dwelling, like a 1 meter extension is something that is pretty common. But I'd say, Daz, for us, we're happy, depending on who you're talking to, we're happy to go wider as well. But a lot of builders are not willing to do that to go against the ridge line. So you have to talk to your builder, get an understanding of what they are willing to accept and or change and not, and then get some confidence in that consultant and their ability to make those changes. Other things you've got noted here, I'm just taking over your notes actually. Extending the garage is pretty safe. And then adding an al fresco, an outdoor room, these sorts of things are pretty common type changes for everyone, just so you're aware. Yeah. Do you have any more you want to add, Daz?
Yeah, I think I was just thinking about the 1 meter extension and some of that stuff, and thinking about even some of the design options that happen. So, for example, if you've got an eave on a house and you want to make your ensuite bigger, sometimes just simply pushing that room out just that little bit under the eave might give you that little bit of room you need. So it could be a really simple change. The room's still just a box, so it hasn't really changed the design of the room. It fits under the roof line still. So it'd be a really simple change to make that would more than likely work. I think where some of these changes get wrong is it's not just extending one room, it's extending every room and putting the whole house back around together. So the 1 meter extension, really easy. Get a simple part of the house and extend it by 1 meter. You kind of basically think it's going to work. There can be some challenges because, I mentioned earlier about, I think I mentioned, if I didn't, what I was going to say certainly is the cost blowouts can come. So you might go, I've added a meter to the length of the home, and it could be on a double story, for example, and that's great. But now, because of that span, you need a steel beam, and that steel beam could cost $6,000 or $7,000, and the sales consultant doesn't know that necessarily. So now you've got this massive surprise cost, and that's the bit that often gets people, and then they're disappointed because they're like, well, you told me it was going to cost me $2,000 to make that change, but in the end it's costing me 10 because the engineers have looked at it, the drafts people, designers have looked at it and gone, hold on, we now need a whopping big steel beam to support that change that you've made. So it's not always easy to get that information up front, and the builder's not going to cover that cost usually. They're not just going to go, great, I'll wear a cost of $10,000 for a beam. They're going to say, sorry, we're passing that cost on, and now you've got this big surprise. So, I guess it's some of those things. A simple change can have a bigger impact, I guess,
Yeah, I think that's quite common. Like, it looks simple, but then when you're thinking about your beam example or with double stories is realigning all the sewer stacks is one thing that consultants don't know how to do properly.
Yep.
So that means like the plumbing under the shower or the ensuite in the bathroom upstairs, if they're there, and that coming downstairs, redesigning a room downstairs can impact that. Redesigning a room upstairs can impact that. So there are a number of cause and effect scenarios. Just what seems like, oh, the layout looks really good now, I'm happy with that. But there's other builder-related things that perhaps might not be known, I should say, by the sales consultant up front, particularly by you, the home buyer, up front, because you wouldn't know some of those things. So what I would say, Darren, is, now, don't get me wrong here, our business is all about making changes, no problem. Some businesses are built that way and they've got a process accordingly. What I would say, though, is we both worked at one of the bigger builders back in the day, and one of the products we worked with was a tick and flick product where it was that plan, no structural changes. You could do a design option in the end, and that was about it. What I would share with you is, if you're talking to a volume builder, you don't need to change your plan. Don't do it, because I can tell you categorically that range, the tick and flick range, saw an improvement in the time frame from sale to permit to get you on site. It saw timeline improvements on site. They were built quicker, and it saw a significant improvement on issues that occurred during the build as a result of the other range where you could make structural changes. So
the other bit that it did also impact, Cole, was the price. So it was priced well, because sorry, those changes or no changes allowed meant that there were less mistakes on site as well, which means that the builder didn't have to allow for potential mistakes on site and the cost of those in their price. So it saved, I'm going to say it saved what, 3%, something like that. It was a 3% cheaper. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but 3% on 300 grand, you're talking it was $10,000 cheaper to build this standard home that didn't allow any changes versus the other one. So the base price straight away was cheaper and the cost to build that home was cheaper because they knew they weren't going to get changes happening and it was going to be really straightforward and they could build it really quickly and not stuff it up.
Yeah. And the other thing is when that file is prepared, ready to go to site, you're giving a file, oh yeah, I've built that plan before. I can build it again, no problem. Yeah, that factory line sort of mentality. But when you're passing out a file that's got a complete custom, then they've really got to sit down and review that. And your odds of a mistake occurring in that event are obviously going to increase. So I think this episode, Darren, we don't want to stop people from making structural changes. We don't want to encourage them one way or the other. We just want to give you a bit of a warning and some of the tips and tricks you can do. So one of those, I guess, to finish off my little part there was more around if you're going to make changes, that's totally fine, but just ask about the process that's in place with that consultant and with that builder before you do so, because you want to make sure that you get at least a concept and ideally some drawings that you get to see, review, and adjust accordingly before you see your contract. That's what I believe. That's how our process is. That's what I believe that the process needs to be. Some builders will have structural changes made with a red pen. The drawings will be done and they'll go straight to contract. The first time the client sees those drawings is when they're expected to sign the contract. So you don't have enough time then. So that's probably one thing I reckon be worth adding. What about, Darren, some of the experiences, I guess, where it can go terribly wrong? We've talked about some that are right, the design options and talking to the right people and asking the right questions and going through the process, getting the drawings earlier. What about where can it go wrong? Can we share some of those?
Yeah, and one I'm always big on, and you don't want to offend people, right, in saying it, but seeking the advice of non-experts. And what I mean by that is, my own expertise. I've got 18 years experience in the industry, probably had my hands on 10,000 homes in some way over that period of time, so it's huge. My experience is enormous. I'm not saying I'm the expert though still. Like I still go and talk to our drafting team and I've had so much experience. So what do I mean by getting advice from non-experts? Your family and your friends, I'm going to suggest they're not architects or draftspeople, so be careful. Like, it's great. They might think they are, but everyone thinks they're a home designer, right? And they're not. And a bit of a frog in my throat this morning, mate. One thing I've always said to people is, would you go and get your jeans and cut one leg off because you think it's going to look good? Like, you just wouldn't do it, right? But people do that to their home. They chop it up with a pair of scissors and stick it all back together and think they're a home expert. And they're spending $250 or $300 or $350, $500,000, $600,000. It's a big mistake. I wouldn't do it to my jeans. I wouldn't cut one leg off and go, I'm going to see if that's going to look good. I'm going to wear it down the street and see what people think of that. The same with your car. You're not going to cut the back doors off your car and switch them with the front doors. You just don't do that. You don't go, we'll give that a go. How's that going to look? It's not going to work. So be really mindful of what that's going to look like. Can you get the back doors off your car and put them on the front? Well, if you get an engineer to help you and you redesign it and you get it right, maybe. Might even look good, right? But the likelihood is probably low if you don't seek the right advice. So that's probably the first bit. Often you don't see what that change is going to look like until a house is built. So you draw it and it looks good on paper, and then it's built and you realize the mistake that you've made. And I've witnessed it even in display homes, and I've got a great memory of a display home in Werribee where the builder we were working for at the time, Cole, we went in, we'd made a couple of changes to the floor plan, which we thought were going to look good, and it looked terrible. So we ended up, and it was the only time I've seen it happen on a display, we paused the display, went back, redesigned it, had to get the permit issued. It was a real challenged to get it done. And builders just won't do that for a customer's job. They're just not going to redesign the house mid-construction because you're realizing now that you've made a mistake. They just don't do that. So if you're expecting them to, you're dreaming, because it's not going to happen, unfortunately. They just can't. They've already got a permit in place. Everything's already there. It's just all too hard.
Yeah.
With things... Sorry, go.
And I'd only say, adding to that, Darren, is some people expect that they can make little tweaks and things like that. But if you do try and attempt that, and a builder, just because they're being nice, allows you to make that tweak, what you're doing is inviting additional problems, because one tweak on site can have this collateral damage or this impact, that the snowball effect, because you've got so many trades, so many suppliers, so many variables. It's not just one simple change sometimes. So that's why builders are pretty stringent on, once we're on site, it is what it is, and that's what we're going to build. That's what's been approved.
Absolutely. And it's going to get worse when the 7-star comes in, because these changes are going to be even harder to make, and making changes on site, just not, they're not happening now. And that there's, I'm saying 99.9% of the time they don't happen. And that 0.001 where they've had to make a change won't even be able to be made then, because you won't be able to get your 7-star through and get all that compliance happening. One example I want to give is, in my very early days, I love taking people through houses under construction. The people wanted to see this particular design. The only place it was, I was working in Deer Park in the west of Melbourne, or the northwest of Melbourne, and the only place that was built was in Hillsville, which is like an hour and a half more, 2 hours the other direction. So I agreed to meet these people in Hillsville to show them this home. So I left my place early, drove to Hillsville to meet them because I had to be back at the display by 11. So, I've driven the other side of town, got there, gone into the home, and these people had put a 2 metre by 2 metre study nook in the middle of their meals area. So now the meals area didn't work. They've got a study you couldn't get a desk into, and it looked ridiculous. And I just, at that point, it was a real eye-opener for myself to say, what duty of care does the builder have to say no? Because that builder should have said, no, you can't do that change. It's stupid. It's never going to work. We're just devaluing your home. They're devaluing their own brand because their sign's out the front. Their friends are going to go, oh, who'd you build this house with? The ex-builder. Oh, geez, I wouldn't build with them then. So there is an obligation back on the builder to say no. That change is silly. I'm really sorry, we won't make it. As much as you might
on them.
want it.
Reflects
Correct.
on the builder. And we have the same situation where we've got clients adamant they want to make those changes. And even though we advise against it, they still want to proceed. So we've had to proceed on a lot of those, and sometimes they're happy with the outcome, sometimes they're not. But we personally, we just think that's not, it's not the greatest outcome. It's not as good as it could have been. So that's another reason you're going to get a bit of kickback from builders, is they've got a brand and some integrity and pride to protect. So probably be mindful of that. That's certainly one thing that I guess they can't force you. Their rules are their rules, I suppose. But for the ones that do allow changes, then if you're going to go all the way through and be adamant about your change, that can backfire a little bit, So please be mindful of that impact.
Absolutely. Cole, I guess back to you. What are some of the good changes? And I know we sort of refer between, is it a structural change or isn't it? What is that, what's the fine line? Because some builders will call it a structural change and others will just call it a change. So, kind of, an improvement, whatever. How's that dialogue? But what are some of the good changes you could throw to? And they're often structural because they're changing that integrity of that home, right? So what would some of those be?
So I'll combine a few cosmetic and structural. So things like adding cavity sliding doors, extending your kitchen bench top or widening a pantry here and there. Like if there's space for those things is all pretty normal and totally acceptable, and it's easy for you, the customer, to view and comprehend, as opposed to making major structural changes. I think extending the depth of a house is totally fine. As a structural change, you've got to check, make sure it doesn't impact your backyard length too much. Extending walls to close off rooms is definitely something that is totally normal. Adding eaves around the home, these sorts of things would be more cosmetic. As far as structural changes, Daz, major ones, I suppose I'd still be in favour of, if you're dealing with a builder that has design options, I'd be in favour of choosing one of those and not adjusting too much. If you're dealing with, I guess, a company like ours or a builder who has a range that enables you to go through the process, then I think that's a good process to go through if you're willing to take that extra time to do it. So then you can, like you said before, Darren, you can pretty much draw it up on a serviette or give the builder a brief and off they go. And that can be a really fun experience. We quite enjoy getting that process or undergoing that process with our customers, because we can go, well, here's the concept plan. It's come to life. And let's work through, whether it does or doesn't work. Yeah. So I think, that's how I'd answer that. Do you have any other good changes you think people should be making?
I think you're on the money. I think changing facades can be dangerous. Making changes to a facade and the detail that goes to that. And I was talking to you earlier about an example where even just a material's got to change on a facade for us at the moment, and then the detail that needs to go behind that. We're changing from a what they call EPS, which is a polystyrene molding that is not an allowable material by that developer. So it's rendered. We have to change it to like a cement sheet blue board, and then they're very different in size and shapes. And then we have to, build that out and redesign it. The end look is identically the same, which is crazy. So what you can see from the street, 100% looks the same. But the design and stuff that needs to go behind the scenes to make that happen is quite difficult. So even within our own business, there were challenges around, do we really want to make that change? It doesn't sound like a lot, but we could really get that wrong on site, and it could not look right. We think we'll cover it and we'll get our details and stuff behind the scenes. But, I think one bit a lot of people don't realize is that builders, you get plans off a builder and you might just get a floor plan and a facade. You might get a floor plan, a facade, and then an electrical plan. You might get some internals, and the more information you get, but behind that comes a whole lot of construction drawings that the builder uses. So often they're common construction drawings, so they don't include them in your plans, but behind the scenes, they say refer to plan A, B, C, D, whatever, and they can go back and find out the detail of how to build that actual component, because that's the tricky bit. You get to some tricky bits on building, and then you're like, well, how does that go together? The builder has that drawn often, the detail of how to put that common, it could be a staircase, how the staircase goes together. It could be this particular facade detail or whatever. So you don't see those plans, but if they don't have that detail, then they're having to guess how to make it on site, and that's where things can go wrong. Yeah. So certainly a challenge there. I guess, Cole, to wrap it up, mate, what advice, do you have for prospective home buyers? Is there anything that you'd touch on there, mate?
Yeah, so probably just to wrap up with some tips for people, I think the first one is understanding it's okay to make structural changes, but make sure if you want to make those changes, you got a regular block, or you want to do those changes just because you've got the budget and you've got the time, go to a person and a builder that understands and has a process ready for you that enables you to go through and see your drawings. And I'm not talking just a visual from bird's eye view, I'm talking full elevations as well, so you can see exactly what it's going to look like. If you're a first home buyer, if you're an investor, and you're someone who's a bit more budget conscious, my advice to you is just don't make structural changes. If you're doing a property for an investment, there are thousands of floor plans available across all the builders. Surely there's one that you're happy with. I just see people make those changes for the sake of making changes. It just adds time, adds complexity, it adds cost, it's unnecessary. And I think you should stick with the standard plan if you are an investor, because that's what they're there for. They'll be built quicker and more efficiently and things like that. I would say limit your changes. If you're going with a volume builder, limit the changes and talk through, like you said, you don't necessarily get all the advice from family and friends unless they are a drafty or an architect. And even still, an architect's not the best person to give advice in our space, because we're a volume building. I guess we're talking about volume building for the most part. It's different to going to a full custom architect style finish of a home, because an architect's going to look at different things. We're just talking about, well, how can we convert that into an extra bedroom? That it's just more structural changes as opposed to design elements and things like that an architect would look at. So that would be my tip, Daz, is don't make them unless you absolutely have to fit the block. and just go through someone who knows the process or has a process for you. And yeah, you mentioned facades. Just for everyone's knowledge, you cannot make a change to a facade after the drawings are completed. Well, you can, but the builder's going to charge you to redraw the whole thing. The facades are not bolt on and bolt off, or clip on, clip off options. They draw a facade, a full set of drawings, that if they change the facade, they have to do the whole thing all over again. Okay, so just a little thing. I didn't know that when I started, Daz, so it's something to share with the listeners.
Yeah,
what about
absolutely.
you? Any final tips for or advice for the home buyers out there?
Yeah, I think try and limit your changes. It's just, and I would always say where possible, if there's a display of the home, go see it. Try
Yep.
it on, walk inside it, look around it. If there's not a display, ask the builder if they've got one under construction, if they're happy to show you through, and often they will. Not always, but often they will. The other part would be often that consultant you're dealing with has made the same change because it works for them and they like it, which is great, but they've made that same change a number of times. So ask if they've got any photos of what it looks like, the finished product, because often they will. They'll be able to show you that. Or if they've got one under construct that's made that same change that they're recommending or that they're sort of leaning you towards. I guess wrapping up, I'm really looking forward to, Colin, there's a little bit of it out there, but I'm really looking forward to the future of where this goes when a drawing's done and now there's a 3D model, whether that be 3D with goggles on or just a 3D, there is some of that now with Revit, one of the drawing programs, where you can see a model of what that looks like and turn it around and do all that sort of stuff. So I think the future is going to be really cool for changes. I think it'll be cool for changes for not only the consumer, the homeowner, but also great for the builder, where they'll be able to see the mistakes before they build the mistakes, and they'll go, hold on, that wall doesn't line up with that wall. How's that going to be built? Because sometimes that's what happens on site. Although it's drawn on a 2-dimensional piece of paper, the 3-dimensional version of that's quite difficult to deliver. So, I think the future is going to be really cool in this space. And I think as more and more technology is available and the speed of which it is, and I think that's the key is, being able to draw a 2-dimensional plan and then have it as a 3-dimensional product within a few seconds is going to be just amazing. So, that's something that we have to look forward to over the next, who knows how many years, 5 or 10 years. There's going to be some real advancements in that space. That'll be awesome. So,
yeah,
right.
No, that's good. I agree. I'm big on technology, and industry falls behind a bit. So it would save a lot of time, a lot of money for a builder and a consumer to see what it's going to look like as an end product before it is one. It'd be fantastic. So, well, Daz, thanks for that. I think that gives people some good insights, and we're not really picking one side or the other. We're just saying be a bit careful, and hopefully we've helped you, added some value to your process as you go through it. So if you like what you hear, please leave us a 5-star review. If you've got any questions, there's a contact us thing on our website, homebuildinghub.com.au. Just send through a question, or if you've got any topic or feedback, topic ideas or feedback, go for it. So, other than that, we will move on to the next one. Thanks for your time, guys. Bye-bye. 1, 2